What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jays Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's, Jaw Raffs, of course. We've got Jays. We got him for days. Josh, how you doing?
Can I be an old man yelling at clouds for a second?
Sure.
I don't think there's too much to actually discuss about all the realignment stuff, but I did want to make one point. Well, two things that go together. First, life would be better and easier for everybody if football just did its own thing.
Or didn't exist, but go on.
That too. Second, I was reading this weekend that there is contemplation, possibly, and I think The Athletic has most of the reporting on this, of trying to set the new Big Ten teams' schedules in a way to benefit the elite Olympic sports at UCLA and USC. So, for example, UCLA's softball team playing the better teams in the Big Ten instead of the bad ones so that it doesn't, bring their metrics down.
Okay.
If I'm the coach of insert bad, Big Ten softball program here, I am furious at this idea that somehow I don't get the opportunity to play good teams, but UCLA does, because we're compensating for UCLA because UCLA decided to join the conference at the expense of its other sports because of football. I know this is just the world we're living in, and I need to get over it, but the fact that they're cherry picking the schedule just really irks me, if that's actually what this ends up being.
I mean, it's the direct result of the backlash, I'm sure, that UCLA and the Big Ten got from the UCLA softball program. Like, you need to give us something to make it sound like you give a damn about us whatsoever. Because none of these moves give a damn about anything other than football, not even basketball. It's so, I mean, that's what that is. But in the world of, it's also not surprising in the world of, hey, let's do everything that we can to make the product worth more, not better.
Right.
No. It's not about making the product better. It's about making the product worth more. And any foundation of college sports is irrelevant to that. Whatever you got to do, regardless of anything that you have to sacrifice because of it, you do it, even if it's this in the simplest terms of, hey, you play the teams in your conference. That doesn't even seem to be that much of a priority anymore.
Because you can't play all the teams in the conference because the conference is too big.
Correct. Yeah, this is 2023 is the year of the sports that I love the most, just fundamentally stripping my love of them for greedy people. Like I don't. It's been a long time since I've loved sports, long time, and the people at the top of it who are greedy about it are the main reason why. Because nobody actually cares about the pedigree and the history behind sport anymore. Nobody does.
Or just the things that make college sports different than professional sports.
Right. That too. So it's super unfortunate, but at this point, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, it is what it is. So you gotta just accept it, move forward.
Yeah.
Just want to yell at clouds for a minute there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's preview time, which is kind of crazy, and it's coming a little earlier than it did last year, just because for the time being, it's still one podcast a week. So the previews are coming around a little bit earlier than they did last year. Same general principle. Josh and I will do our own preview, and it'll be coupled not in the same week as it was last year, but it'll be coupled later down the road by a conversation with someone who either covers a team in that conference, covers the conference. As per usual, we'll have some people on the show that I'm sure listeners will recognize, people who have become staples in those conversations over the last few years. But this time around, we'll start the first 6 weeks of the previews. We'll just be Josh and I discussing each conference. That gives us a little more time for the previews to breathe, and also a little more time to coordinate interviews and not have to change around schedules of when the conferences would have come out, based on when those interviews can be done. Those conversations can be recorded. So 6 weeks of just us chatting about the Power Six conferences, and then we'll move into conversations with those who cover the leagues and teams in said leagues. Now, we're going to do our best to guess which teams are in which leagues. I mean, your guess is as good as mine at this point, but we'll do our best to actually get to not accidentally interview a Big Ten school, someone who covers a now Big Ten school in the Pac-12 preview. But it's gonna be difficult. Anywho, ACC preview. If you've been here before, you know how this works. Break it down into a selection of categories to try and hit on as many teams as possible, but also not just kind of meander one team after another and not have any real structure for it. So the team that you are most excited for is the first category, followed by the team you are most intrigued by. Then storylines is kind of the place that we can try and touch on as many teams as possible. And then we'll move to teams that could make the NCAA tournament and a winner of the conference, because it wouldn't be a conference preview if we didn't pick a winner. All right, Josh. The team in the ACC that you are most excited for in somehow it's the 2023-24 college basketball season. That is ridiculous. But alas, here we are. Who's the team you're most excited for?
That would be Duke.
Uh-huh.
Just really excited to see how good this team can be. It's not very often you get a returning core that is essentially a starting lineup. Mm-hmm. Jeremy Roach, Tyrese Proctor, Mark Mitchell, Kyle Filipowski, Ryan Young. Plus, you've got, 3 top 25-ish recruits, another one in TJ Power who's right behind in the top 30-ish range. So, yes, it's not, the recruiting class of last season, but you still have the Jared McCains and Sean Stewarts and Caleb Fosters who are expecting to make a massive impact here. And oh, by the way, you have a starting lineup of returners that are also either super experienced, super high profile recruits. Kyle Filipowski is probably your ACC preseason player of the year, I would have to think. There's just a lot of things to be very excited about here. And then the other part of this is that group that's coming back clearly figured something out by the end of last season. They were a much better basketball team by the end than they were at the beginning. You could see the progress. Did they reach the expectations that they had? No. But that's a good foundation, and there's some confidence to build on of we actually did get better, we're getting more comfortable, and now you throw on the talent that they're adding with all the pieces coming back, and boy, are they going to be good.
I agree. The other possibility is Armando Bacot,
sure,
as an ACC preseason player of the year, but I would probably lean Filipowski in that conversation. But yeah, it's Duke is this season's, look at the combination of high level recruits and returning talent roster, right? It's been Kentucky in the past, it's been Duke in the past, and this year it's Duke. Like you said, you could put together a top 25 starting lineup with the guys that they have coming back, and then you add at least at 247 Sports 4 of the top 22 guys in the class of 2023. Um, I there's a couple reasons I'm super excited about Duke. One, I think there isn't a lot of redundancy between the returning talent
Yep.
and the recruits. I think, Jared McCain is a little bit undersized at the shooting guard position, but that's definitely the place that I think he'll start with his shooting abilities. I think he makes sense next to either Tyrese Proctor or Jeremy Roach in that backcourt. Um, Caleb Foster is my favorite recruit of these four, not necessarily the most talented of the four, but I love big guards, and he's a 6'5" point guard that moves at a pace that I really enjoy, and I think he could fill a lot of different roles. And the fact that he's 6'5", he can kind of be on the floor with a bunch of different types of lineups. Um, Sean Stewart and TJ Power are both power forwards, but they're two very different power forwards. And you can either put them with, a very skilled technical lineup with TJ Power and Kyle Filipowski in the front court, or you can have this uber versatile Sean Stewart, Mark Mitchell type, this big kind of middle of your lineup that you feel like you can kind of switch everything. If you throw Caleb Foster and Tyrese Proctor in there, you have four guys that are all over 6'5" or and under 6'9". So there's a lot of switchability there. So there's a lot of theoretical versatility that just come from the different types of lineups you can put together. And that comes from the fact that you have four returning guys that you really like, and you can throw Ryan Young in there to add, five if you want to, but specifically Roach, Filipowski, Mitchell, and Proctor. And it doesn't feel like you only have six guys between them and the recruits, because two of them really play the exact same position that one of those returning guys already plays. Like, there's no way that Duke's backcourt isn't awesome this year, because they have four chances, and
Yeah.
two of them are already proven college basketball commodities in Jeremy Roach and Tyrese Proctor. But there's just no way that they don't have at least two guys that are all ACC level guards. There just isn't a world, even if one of those two guys returning struggles at points this year. Just they're going to be deep, and they've got the makings of a team that can be really, really good.
The final thing I'll throw out there, specifically Proctor and Mitchell, didn't necessarily have spectacular freshman seasons in terms of doing something like Filipowski did, where you went, oh, he's just the best player on this team, But you give them an off season now after that experience where they know what this is like, what they wish they would have done differently preparing for last season, skill development, all of that kind of stuff. You saw what they could do and you saw the potential. So now you even have that upside as well. It's not just returning guys, but it's guys that are kind of equipped and set up to step into these bigger roles, and yet you feel like there is more to come from them, as opposed to just, these players. You're very big on this, right? The players come back, but do they actually get better? I feel like there's all kinds of room for Mitchell and Proctor to actually come back, and you start watching the season, you go, oh, they're on a different level than they were as freshmen.
The last thing I'll say, and it's kind of been the thing that we point out every year in the Duke one and done era, is the only thing I'm a little bit concerned about is finding shooting consistently. Now, there's a way in which you don't have to worry about this. If TJ Power and Jared McCain come in, TJ Power kind of shot up the rankings late in his high school career because he became a really good 3-point shooter and really turned into a stretch four type player. If he and Jared McCain both come in and shoot it well, and Mark Mitchell builds on 35% from the 3-point line and Jeremy Roach builds on 34% from the 3-point line, then it becomes a lot less of an issue. But if if both of those returning guys are around 35% and it takes McCain and Power a while to start knocking down shots at a high level, then that can that could be a concern. I think there are good shooters on this roster. There have been times that we come into the Duke season and I'm not totally sure whether or not there are any good shooters on the Duke roster. I think there are good shooters this year, but it'll depend just how good they are as a shooting team will depend, I think, a little bit on how quickly those freshmen translate into good college shooters.
Yeah, because you don't look at any of the returners as their bread and butter being shooting.
Correct.
There are a lot of them who can, and, Filipowski can stretch the floor. There are guys who can shoot, but yeah, it's a fair point that need a little bit more consistency, a little bit higher conversion rate there from those guys.
And then you have the other thing I'll just throw out there is year 2 of John Shire, which is make of that what you will. I think you got off to a strong start in year 1, and there's just building continuity in terms of how that program is being run under Shire. Okay, I am. If you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing me sink to the ground repeatedly in my chair because my chair is broken. So while you tell me about which team is most intriguing to you, I'm going to grab this chair to my left so that I'm no longer sinking over and over and over again.
I have selected Miami as my most intriguing team for a couple different reasons. One, just simply what do they do after last season? They're going to get a lot of attention after a very, very good season in which obviously they nearly won a national championship. And you have Nigel Pack, Norchad Omier, Luka Poplar, Bensley Joseph coming back, so it's not like you're replacing your entire team. There are obviously pieces that are gone. And you're also bringing in Matthew Cleveland, which is the other reason I'm really intrigued by this team. I always felt like Matthew Cleveland was going to be the next guy in that list of versatile, sort of positionless Florida State guys who don't put up big numbers but become really good NBA players. And it just quite hasn't happened that way for him yet. So now, new environment, what does he look like, trying to replace some of what this Miami team lost. And then obviously you can make a strong argument this was the best team in the ACC last season with the fact that they shared the regular season title, obviously the NCAA tournament success. So there's just a lot of interesting aspects to this for me, both from the roster this season and then obviously the added context of what they did last season.
Yeah, I see I find Miami intriguing as well. They're not my they're not my most intriguing team, but they are definitely on that list for me, that short list, because on one hand you lose Isaiah Wong, you lose Jordan Miller, you lose a lot of what you lost the best player on your team, and Jordan Miller, I think probably the most underappreciated guy on that team, right?
Definitely.
You talked about Nigel Pack and Isaiah Wong first, but that guy was just as good as those two guys. And then on the other side, like I think Nigel Pack, Matthew Cleveland, and Norchad Omier together, I think that's enough. That should be enough for you to threaten. Maybe not the top of this conference, but you shouldn't be like, I'm not sure Miami should be stressing about making the tournament, even with what they lost. That's a really, really solid place to start for a team that, maybe it's not a team that has a ceiling of 1 or 2 in the ACC this year, but maybe it's 3, 4, 5. That's lots of talent in those 3 guys. And that should be enough, even though there's still a ton of questions about, there's a ton of just productivity numbers that were put up last year that you have to replace. So that will always leave a question mark, but I find that, they'll be super intriguing. The other part is, how do we feel about Miami from last year if they don't go to the Final Four? You're also big on not determining just how good a team was based on their tournament run. And Miami was good last year. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that Miami doesn't deserve to be thought of as a team that, 29-8, 15-5 in the ACC. That's a good basketball team, even if they lose in the first round. But it certainly is talked about different if they lose in the first round of the round of 32 and nobody really remembers their season. Instead, they went to the Final Four, and just as a result, you're going to be looked at differently the following year.
The other aspect of this, real quick, that I'm interested in, this team is going to have 2 tall players.
As opposed to 1?
Yeah.
Sure.
That is one of the things I'm intrigued by. What does this look like without a true 4-out, 1-in system where obviously Matthew Cleveland has guard-like skills and is not a back-to-the-basket power forward. But just the idea of there are 2 fairly tall players out there as opposed to 4 pure, generally undersized guards. Very interested by that.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. It's as we get closer to the season, I'll be watching how people feel about the expectations of Miami, because it's not the same team and the dynamics are going to be very different. And it was one of those teams that had really clear flaws, but the thing that they did so well last year. And I'm not sure if they're going to be truly elite at anything the way that they were last year, and we'll see how that translates. The team I'm most intrigued by is the Tar Heels.
That was going to be my other option.
The North Carolina Tar Heels. So let's run through it. Gone. Leaky Black, Pete Nance, Puff Johnson, Caleb Love. Gone. Still here. RJ Davis, Armando Bacot. Not unimportant. Arrivals: Cormac Ryan, Harrison Ingram, Paxson Wojcik, lefty sharpshooter. Sure, I'm in. Whenever you want a lefty sharpshooter, me, sure. Jalen Withers, Louisville transfer. And then you have Elliot Cadeau and one other transfer, but Elliot Cadeau is the 5-star, the borderline top 10 recruit in the 2023 class. This is one of those teams that I have no idea what they're going to look like, and what their best 5 lineup is going to look like, and who their second most important perimeter player is going to be. And, usually that's not a great thing. It's usually we're looking at teams like Georgetown that oh my gosh, I have no idea, or LSU post Will Wade when it's absolutely nobody on the team, and from the year before, and it's not quite that, right? Building around Armando Bacot and RJ Davis is not an insignificant thing to gloss over, especially when talking about the idea of starting from square one. You're not starting from square one, but a lot of the peripheral pieces are different, and especially when you had a high volume guard like Caleb Love, and that was so much of your offense, whether you wanted it to be or not. Without him being there, that's just there's a lot of pivoting that goes on there. Clearly, Hubert Davis said, we are not going to be 322nd in the country in 3-point field goal shooting again. Went out and got Cormac Ryan, Paxson Wojcik, Jalen Withers. All of them are spectacular 3-point shooters. Withers shot 41% from the 3-point line at Louisville last year. It's pretty good. Cormac Ryan was the worst of those, and no one's actually questioning Cormac Ryan's ability to shoot the 3-pointer. It was just it wasn't a great year on a not great team at Notre Dame last year. So that's not going to happen again. I think Elliot Cadeau is really, really interesting. He gives me Carson Edwards vibes, his high school tapes. He's like this stocky kind of guard. He has the same kind of hair vibe that Carson Edwards had, especially in that last year that he was at Purdue. He seems to not be interested in anybody's respect when he's going to the front of the rim. He'll try to poster absolutely anybody, and Carson Edwards would absolutely try to poster anybody. But he's super interesting as well. There's a lot of guards here, whether it's your veteran college shooters and kind of off ball guys. But it might be Elliot Cadeau that's the best equipped to have the ball in his hands as the facilitator and the instigator of this offense, which I think is super interesting with, even with all of the veteran backcourt presence that they have, he still might be the guy who's best suited to run the offense. But it's all fascinating to me. I want to hear your thoughts on how Hubert Davis has built this, and then I have kind of a bigger thing that I want to talk about that is another part of why this is all very intriguing to me. But I want to hear what you think about this roster.
I am mentally prepared to fall in love with Elliot Cadeau.
Sure.
I'm already getting myself ready for that. And I kind of like the Carson Edwards comparison in terms of, yeah, he gets downhill and he makes things happen, which is a really interesting dynamic for this team that didn't do a lot of that last year.
A lot of dancing with the ball last year.
Elliot Cadeau is not really about dancing. He's about attacking. And the other part of his
just
game,
to be clear, not actually comparing him to Carson Edwards in terms of his impact. By the way, I'm not disrespecting Carson Edwards like that. That's one of the like 7 most impactful relative to his team guys in the last like 10 years in college basketball. So not actually, but he has the same vibe, 100%.
And what I love about him is that he's kind of equipped to do everything, which is why I want the ball in his hands. Is obviously he can score and he can attack the basket, but he's not locked into that. He can shoot the ball a little bit, at least. We'll have to see how good of a shooter he is, but he's at least comfortable in that space. And I feel like he has a really good feel in terms of playing in the pick and roll and actually doing the point guard things. Even if he's not a quote unquote traditional point guard because he's so electric with the ball in his hands, right? Carson Edwards wasn't a quote unquote point guard either, but you can make that work. But the thing I keep coming back to is this team needs somebody to make good decisions with the basketball, right? That's what we kept hammering home the past 2 years. I watch Elliot Cadeau and I see a guy who makes really good decisions with the basketball in his hand and has a great feel for just how to operate an offense. And he's super talented, so he can do, if you need 30 points from him, he can probably go get you those 30 points because you can't really stay in front of him. But also, he throws alley-oops. He finds guys in transition. I just see a complete, again, not necessarily maybe a true point guard. Maybe he's not playing point guard in the NBA. We'll have to see. But I felt much better watching Elliot Cadeau highlights and how he could help this offense run than I did with Caleb Love and RJ Davis as your ball handlers last season.
Yeah, and I think, and he has a little Cole Anthony in him, but not in the way that, to your point, because that was kind of the other, I was like, this feels familiar, but the more I watched, the more I felt like, and to all of the points that you're pointing out there, that I feel like he's going to come in and do a little bit more than that. Like we stumbled into Cole Anthony just kind of being the dude, and that's all he did was score. And you saw UNC have a very real ceiling that year as a result. And maybe that's been the issue the last 2 years, is when you have guards that are talented but relatively one-dimensional and kind of are redundant. I'd love to have, I suppose if I'm picking one of the two, I'd like to have RJ Davis, which is probably why Caleb Love isn't there anymore. But I don't need 2 of those guys. And I don't think we're in jeopardy of Elliot Cadeau just being one of those 2 high volume, poor decision making guards that have been in that backcourt for the last couple seasons.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to touch on is This is an important year for Hubert Davis, I think, in his not in the we could be seeing way out in the distance the finish line of Hubert Davis's tenure at UNC, because I think he bought himself as long as perhaps he might just want with a Final Four run when he did it. But I think like we're gonna find out what was a fluke. Which of the last 2 years was a fluke?
It's a great way to put it.
And I have a couple ways to, and not really the last 2 years, just the last 22 months that didn't include a 2-month run. So check this out. From February 8th to the end of the season in 2022, they were 13-3. They lost once in the regular season. They lost to Virginia Tech in the ACC tournament, and then they lost to Kansas in the national championship. They were 13-3. In the other 56 games that UNC has played in Hubert Davis's tenure, they're 36-20. They're 8-11 against ranked opponents, and 3 of those victories came in the NCAA tournament in that run. So otherwise, because one of those losses was to Kansas, so he's 5-10 against ranked opponents over those 2 years, apart from the 2022 NCAA tournament. And he's 36-20 as the head coach of UNC outside of the 13-3 run at the end of the 2021-22 season. Now, you can't take those things away from him. That's not what I'm saying, but it's a fair question because right now that's the defining factor of Hubert Davis's short tenure at UNC thus far. But there is an argument that the other 56 games are really what his tenure at UNC has been about frustrating, feeling like your talented teams are less than the sum of their parts, that you can't get it through your players' heads to make better decisions with the basketball. And hey, Caleb Love, maybe not another contested 29-footer, right? And that's what last year was dictated by, to the point where you went from from a national championship runner-up to being the first team, to being the only team ever to be the preseason number 1 team in the country that didn't make the NCAA tournament. And all of that to say, this year we're going to get to the end of the season, and based on how this UNC season goes, there's going to be more discourse about Hubert Davis as the UNC head coach, I think, in one way or another, because you have 2 polar opposite conclusions to the year, at least. And as a result, 2 polar opposite feelings about Hubert Davis's first 2 years at UNC. And I feel like this year we're going to get an idea of which one we feel like was actually more legit. And I think that is super intriguing to kind of have that discourse over this UNC season as we go through it.
Here's the other part too. He basically got a do-over with the roster. Right? Now, you keep Armando Bacot. Armando Bacot's one of the most dominant big men in college basketball. RJ Davis, obviously a very good college basketball player. But like you said, clearly there was a philosophical decision made to do this differently. If this doesn't work, it's not just, okay, these are kind of the players he inherited and they decided to stick around, and maybe they were just too stubborn, and you can make a case for, and right, maybe they just got too confident to the point where it was arrogant after making the national championship game. There are reasons you can come up with as to why it's not on Hubert Davis, everything that happened last season. This team is his making because of the transfers, right? His recruits now 100%, all of that stuff. So I'm right there with you that, and if it's another train wreck, I will be very curious to see what kind of leash and how much patience North Carolina has. Not that jobs are in danger at this point, but if this team again is that bad, we're having a very different conversation.
No. And that bad in a bad conference. And I'm sure we're going to get to that here, storylines in just a second, but it doesn't feel like this is going, and last year wasn't the case really either. Not at all. So it's not like they're a team with high expectations, but they just ended up being the team that lost more than they won in the Big 12 because somebody has to.
Mm-hmm.
They can't hide behind the deep nature of their conference, at least not this year. So it's going to be very obvious one way or another. And there's only one outcome that I think will be acceptable to the general public. Like if they go 21-13, like we're going to have these conversations again because they shouldn't go 21-13. They should be better than that.
Yeah.
Storylines. What do you got for me?
First one, does somebody run away with this thing? And I'm looking at you, Duke. You had 5 teams that won 14 or 15 conference games last season.
Just right? Crazy.
Jumbled mess from beginning to end. And as you were just alluding to, nobody was totally convincing. Clearly, Miami was good. Duke was very good by the end of the season, but obviously they had some stumbling blocks in there and were not consistent from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're talking right about your Pitts of the world, which great story, good basketball team. Is anybody really terrified of what Pitt did last season? But that was the opportunity that
this offseason.
That the ACC presented because nobody could just do what Virginia typically does and put together, instead of 14 or 15, 16, 17 wins, right? Because even Virginia, again, very good basketball team. Did they put fear in you like teams that Virginia passed? No. Mm-mm. And that's not including North Carolina, those 5 teams, to your point. You look at this thing on paper, and there's Duke and there's everybody else. But you could have said the same thing last year if you would have been told that North Carolina wasn't going to be what people thought North Carolina was going to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like somebody stepped up to fill that gap and really push Duke. Duke just also didn't have, from a regular season standpoint, the season that they were expected to. Does that change this time? And there are also, some teams in here that had really good seasons last season that you're looking at and going, not so sure they can replicate that. Mm-hmm. So, to me, the first storyline is just, for example, can North Carolina hang with Duke? Does Duke let people stay in the conversation? Or is Duke up 2 games pretty early and they just kind of coast to a regular season title?
Yeah, I have the cousin of this storyline is does anybody feel close to Duke?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And not even necessarily from a who wins the conference perspective, because I'm not totally sure I care if, and maybe somebody will just be on that level, but I'm not totally sure it absolutely is mutual that someone else wins this conference, and I actually feel like that team is as good as Duke. If that makes any sense at all. Because from a talent perspective, nobody is especially close. And we've done this dance before with Duke in the regular season, and they just make silly mistakes. They lose at home to NC State. They lose a game at Virginia Tech that you should win if you're as good as Duke was supposed to be in that hypothetical year, but they lose to Virginia Tech anyways, and then UNC or Miami or Virginia then gets that game at Virginia Tech, and it's all way closer than it probably should be. Mm-hmm. So one, do I feel like anybody is anywhere in sniffing distance of Duke in terms of quality of team? And what goes with that is can Duke just go take care of business and win 16 games? Because if you get to 16, I find it really hard to believe that anybody's going to catch you.
Mhm.
And maybe 15 in this particular year, but 16 for sure. Can you just go out and beat 16 teams that you should beat and win this conference? It's not something, as we've touched on a gajillion times in the past decade, it's not something they do very often.
Yep.
What's next?
My second one is kind of what happens for the encore here. Talked about Miami earlier, but I'm more curious about the teams that we started last season's preview talking about. I believe one of my storylines was the coaches on the hot seat. And I know we talked to Brendan Marks about this too. And then look what happens. Pitt, phenomenal season. NC State, really good season. Clemson, good season. All three of those coaches might have saved their jobs.
Yeah.
So now what?
Sure.
Is there a long-term impact of that season? Have these programs actually made progress? Or was that a one-off and we are going to see a much more familiar version of the ACC standings where your top four teams are something like Duke, UNC, Miami, and Virginia? That's all.
It's so hard to get to like maintain momentum when you're those teams. It's so hard.
Yeah.
It was already difficult. You know, you'd have a season like Georgia Tech a few years ago when you have Jose Alvarado and the ACC Player of the Year, and you kind of catch lightning in a bottle for a season. But then those guys leave and you're back to, I mean, Georgia Tech was 15 and 18 last year.
And to me,
the coach of that team is no longer there. You're right. Josh Pastner is no longer the coach at Georgia Tech. It's just so hard. And then you add the fact that those guys a lot of times are going to take that opportunity. One moment, amateur podcaster going to turn off my phone. There we go. Especially when it's a program that doesn't have a history of being at the tippity top of the conference over and over again. Those players like to parlay that into going to a place that they're going to have a better chance of being even better the following year. It's just so difficult. So difficult.
Or you get a situation like Pitt last season, where a lot of players ended up there because of the opportunity to play a big role and kind of the second or third opportunity, kind of a fresh start. One season, and now you're talking about Blake Hinson as your only notable returner for that Pitt team that was so good.
Right.
And so it's a very different conversation. I'm sure we'll get to this a little bit as we sort of run down the teams at the end. But everybody else is gone.
Yeah.
So you had a terrific season, and that group worked really well together because they were super experienced and knew what it took to win college basketball games. But there's no way to build on that because you don't have the personnel. You're still kind of starting from scratch.
Kind of in that conference-wide conversation, ACC finished 7th at KenPom last year. 7th. That's unacceptable. Unacceptable.
You tell them.
It is. It's totally unacceptable.
You're right.
The Mountain West was a better conference at KenPom last year than the ACC. Duke, Virginia, a Final Four team, and not to mention the team that was the number one overall team in the preseason AP poll. And the Mountain West was better last year from a KenPom perspective. I don't think this is not the year they return to national prominence. What I'm curious about is Miami, great season. Virginia and Duke, they're typically a part of when the ACC is good, so we'll leave them to the side. Clemson, 23-11. Pitt, 24-12. NC State, 23-11. I don't think anybody cares when it comes to how they feel about like if there's a team like, I don't know, Kansas State in the Big 12 and they have a year like that, and there's a jump from a team that's maybe a little unexpected in a conference like that, or it's mostly the Big 12, but even like a conference like the Big 10, it it seems like people care. It seems like people then contribute that to how good that conference actually is. And I'm not sure anybody was actually doing that last year with those teams. It was more, it's like, yeah, Clemson won 23 games because the ACC was bad,
Right.
not because they were good.
Because you can flip it and say, well, somebody had to win the games.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
In the same reason, in the same way of the Big 12, well, somebody has to go 5-13. That's just the way that it works. Somebody has to go. Now, granted, there were 5 teams between 15-5 and 14-6 in the conference last year, but that was much more of a commentary on somebody has to win them rather than somebody has to lose them. And does that start to change this year? I'm not totally sure that it does. Does the ACC just keep going kind of in this direction of you could have a couple elite teams at the top of the conference, but you're never like, are we ever going to get back to the days where you feel like there are 9 really good teams in the ACC, the way that we feel about the Big 10 pretty much every year?
Where you just never want to play a road game.
Right. Even if it's not, because it's like there's an elite team in the ACC more often than there's an elite team in the Big 10.
Yep.
But the Big 10 has the depth that the ACC hasn't had in a really long time, relatively speaking. But, 7th at KenPom last year. They haven't finished better than 5th since the 2019-20 season when they finished 5th. They haven't been a top 2 conference since 2017-18. And they haven't been KenPom's best conference in the sport since 2006 and 7. And I'm not sure this is the year that we start to. I'm not sure this is the year that we flip that feeling. But do we start going in the other direction? Maybe it's in the way of actually Miami's really good again this year. And maybe that's just a team that we can count on being really good because that's part of the Big Ten's depth. They just have 7 teams that you can count on them being really solid. Like even when Wisconsin, who wasn't very good last year, but even when Wisconsin has a roster that you're not super inspired by, they're still going to be really hard to play. And it's still a team that's going to be top 50 at KenPom. And they're just going to put together a respectable season. And there are like 7 of those teams in the Big Ten. That you don't even have to worry about it. Sure, Indiana might be a little disappointing, but it's like a disappointing team that's still like a top 60 KenPom team. And, Ricochet shot at Indiana, but you get what I'm saying? There's just so many of those teams. And maybe this is the year that some of these teams that we don't think are going to stack the building blocks actually do, whether it's a Clemson team, a Pitt team, an NC State team, whoever it might be, a Miami team that we just talked about. It'll be interesting what kind of, just how good they are on the back end of a Final Four appearance. Maybe we start to turn that in the other direction, or maybe not. We'll see.
You ready for my final one?
Yeah, I've got one more as well.
Yeah. Simply the new eras.
The new eras. Are you channeling Taylor Swift right now? Are you eras touring?
That was
right
100% unintentional. I want to make that very clear.
Wow.
Just not only do you have a couple new coaches, but you have a couple new coaches I'm very interested in for different reasons. Obviously, Adrian Autry at Syracuse, somebody not named Jim Boeheim is coaching the Syracuse men's basketball program. And what does this, and we'll get to talking more about Syracuse later, but what does this look like? Do they dare play man-to-man defense?
1975-76 was the last time that wasn't the case, by the way.
Thank you. There you go. I don't think I need to, and obviously Adrian Autry knows that program inside and out. There's a reason he is the person succeeding Jim Boeheim. But that's a big deal, Instead of talking about Hubert Davis taking over for Roy Williams, John Shire taking over for Mike Krzyzewski, we're talking about the change at Syracuse. And then Micah Shrewsbury at Notre Dame. I'm a huge Micah Shrewsbury guy. What he did at Penn State was phenomenal. Obviously, Notre Dame, didn't go great last season. It had kind of been on the downturn. You kept saying, well, if they get everything to come together, that could be a really good basketball team, and it just never came together. So he's got a massive rebuild on his hands and kind of just wiping the slate clean and starting over, which is what he did at Penn State, and he did a terrific job. And obviously, they were a very good basketball team, made the NCAA tournament, all that stuff. So it's not just 2 coaching changes, but it's 2 coaching changes that, to me, carry an extra level of significance because of the brands, the history of the programs, and also, as you were just talking about, the fact that at its best, Syracuse is up there at least causing some chaos in the ACC, right? And Notre Dame is one of those teams that when the ACC is at its best, you can just kind of count on to show up and be an NCAA tournament team. Yeah. That hasn't been the case recently.
Louisville.
Yes.
Louisville to that.
Yes, exactly. Same idea. So that's the other storyline for me is I'm very excited to see what these new coaches can do.
Yeah, I'm in. The last thing I have is there are a couple of transfers that transferred from one school in this conference to another school in this conference, and they might have real impact on who is like the 5th and final team to make the NCAA tournament or the 6th and final team to make the NCAA tournament that I just wanted to mention. The first one is Matthew Cleveland from Florida State to Miami. I think Florida State's going to have a bounce back year, but also because the ACC isn't going to have that many true needle mover games this year, at least it doesn't look that way going in. That bounce back might just mean they're on the bubble, and Matthew Cleveland not being there could be the deciding factor. Miami could struggle some in this post Isaiah Wong era. Seems like a much more impactful era than when I say it like that. But what kind of impact does Matthew Cleveland have at Miami? And then another team that I think could be in the bubble conversation is Syracuse, and JJ Starling made a jump from Notre Dame to Syracuse. Both of those guys, Cleveland was 13.7 points and 7.5 rebounds per game. Starling was never anywhere near as good at Notre Dame as Fighting Irish fans hoped he was going to be. 11.2 points and 3 rebounds per game there. So still a productive college basketball player. Just a couple of former highly ranked recruits making moves inside the ACC that I think when we get to the end of the season and we're talking about bubbles and we're talking about those teams that could make the NCAA tournament in the ACC, that those type of guys might have an impact on that. Tyler Nickel, also a top 60, 90, a UNC transfer to Virginia Tech, which is kind of on the back burner. I must admit, it was Starling and Cleveland that kind of prompted this storyline, but Tyler Nickel wanted to mention him as well.
Yeah, there are a couple more as well, and obviously we already talked about Jalen Withers. It is interesting that when you're going through kind of looking at the NCAA tournament teams and the biggest additions and subtractions to some of those teams, you go, oh, right, that's a lot of guys who have played in the ACC before that are now at new schools.
So I'm interested in that more specifically with those teams that I think, right, Louisville is going to suck, Notre Dame is going to suck. Those guys had, guys who went to a team, or I guess one team in particular, that, UNC is a team that has aspirations of winning this conference. It's teams like the Florida States, the Miamis, the Virginia Techs, the Syracuses of the world that I think are all going to kind of be in that that same kind of, are these teams actually good? Somebody has to make the tournament kind of conversation when it comes to this conference. So we'll see. How many teams can make the tournament, Josh?
I think you're going to be angry with me.
With 14.
I said 10.
You said 10? Okay, I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have 8.
Okay.
That could make the tournament. So as this usually goes, we'll go through I'll start reading my list. We can pause and talk as necessary. And then once I get to the end of my list, you can add the 2 that that I don't have on my list.
Before you start, I would like to say this 10 comes from I don't have a lot of confidence in most of these teams. So the gap between 10 and, 5 is just so
Mhm.
small that I went, well, I could see that team finishing 6th because I don't necessarily believe that other team is going to finish 5th more than I
Mhm.
think there's going to be 10 good teams in this conference.
There are 3 teams that I'm absolutely confident will make the tournament
That sounds
out of this
about right.
conference. There are 3. And there are 6 teams that I feel like could make up maybe the other 2 spots that
Right,
this, that
right.
this conference gets.
Yeah.
3 if we have a good season, but I'm kind of in that same realm as well. Okay, the obvious ones, Duke and UNC,
Mm-hmm.
those teams can make the tournament. You'll be
Are you
shocked.
sure?
I'm positive. Virginia, Reese Beekman is back, exercising an extra season, so that's a W. I feel like Virginia could have been in a much sketchier place coming into the season if he wasn't on this roster, but he is. Jordan Minor, highly productive player from Merrimack. He's kind of the headline transfer. Dante Harris from
Yep.
Georgetown as well. We are post Kihei Clark era. I feel like we could use the word era.
Oh, it's an
for
era.
Kihei Clark.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's interesting though because you know how I feel about your most important player being a man under 6 feet tall, just in terms of and Kihei Clark was never a liability defensively, and that's generally what I'm talking about when I talk about that kind of thing. But still, your general height going up, and therefore some versatility maybe going up a little bit. My questions about Virginia revolve more around the fact that they haven't won a tournament game since they won the national championship in 2019, which is wild, by the way. But I find it hard to believe that Tony Bennett in this conference doesn't find a way to make the tournament. That was the third of my 3 teams that I am confident in their ability to make the NCAA tournament. I have Florida State on this list. Cameron Fletcher is back after missing most of last season. That's kind of this is reason number 1 why you shouldn't be totally sad about Florida State. Primo Spears transferring from Georgetown, that's a lot of points, and at least we can have a conversation about how meaningful any of his points he scored in college have been, but he can score. Darren Green Jr. is back as well. I like Leonard Hamilton's an excellent coach. It is interesting when you look at his tenure. Kind of, he goes to the NCAA tournament and blocks, and he misses the NCAA tournament and blocks. Like he's had multiple 4 or 5 year stretches without going to the tournament, and then he'll have this really awesome 4-year stretch.
Sweet 16 every season. Yeah.
Right. It's been a couple years since they went to the tournament, so make of that what you will.
They couldn't score, rebound, or defend the 3 last season. That's not a recipe for success.
Tough. Virginia Tech can make the tournament. Hunter Couture is about what they have coming back, at least in terms of proven commodities in a Virginia Tech uniform.
I would like to add Sean Padua in there too, just because I love both of them.
Sure. I'm not totally sure how good that team is going to be, but they could make the tournament. Syracuse, we talked about JJ Starling. Judah Mentz is back as their second leading scorer from a season ago. Benny Williams is back as well. Chance Westry, a former top 50 guy, started at Auburn. Knee injury before the season, never really got any footing there. We talked about Adrian Autry as I think that breathes some life into the program. We were kind of in a spot with Syracuse where you need the coach to just be a little bit more excited and put a little bit more effort into, no fault of Boeheim. Like we said, Boeheim had been the coach for 50 years. And 50 at Syracuse, it's hard to blame him for maybe not having the energy and the desire to rebuild a program yet again. And I feel like just a new coach breathing life into that kind of thing is a good thing. So I think Syracuse can make the tournament. Mr. 19 and 14 themselves. Wake Forest, aka Gonzaga's younger brother, with Afton Reed and Hunter Salas. Central Michigan's Kevin Miller there after averaging 18 points in 4 games and then missing the rest of the season with a foot injury. But if you start with Afton Reed and Hunter Salas, like there are worse places to start. And then my last team is Miami. Nigel Pack, Matthew Cleveland, Norchad Omie is enough to get you in the tournament conversation. Those are my 8. And feel free to comment on any of those, circle back, or just add your 2 on top.
So I actually have 3 that I'm adding. And I'm trying to figure out what the third one is. Oh, yes. Okay. Because I do not have Virginia Tech.
Okay.
And the other case you can make here is Rodney Rice was a highly touted recruit. He played 8 games because of injuries. He was good in those 8 games. If he's healthy, now you're talking about a Couture, Padula, Rice trio, and maybe you're onto something. My hesitation with Virginia Tech is this. They beat Duke, Virginia, Pittsburgh, Penn State, and Oklahoma State, and still lost 15 times, 12 of which came in conference.
Sure.
They just didn't beat the bad ACC teams last season. They didn't do what they were supposed to. Now, could that change? Sure. They're going to get another opportunity because it's going to be a similar story. There's not enough proven on that roster for me to put them on this list. So the 3 that I had in addition, Clemson, PJ Hall is there. If PJ Hall is there, they have a chance.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Jack Clark coming in from NC State, Joe Girard coming in from Syracuse, 2 more intra-conference transfers. Yes, you lost Hunter Tyson and Brevin Galloway. Do I think they're going to make the tournament? No. They're probably number 10 on my list. But if PJ Hall is there, with what they did last season, I'm giving them a chance. Mm-hmm. And then the other 2, NC State, you got DJ Burns, Casey Morsell back. DJ Horn, MJ Rice headlined this interesting group of transfers. Again, with what they did last season, with what MJ Rice could be coming from Kansas, I talked myself into it. Again, do I feel great? No, but to me, they're in the ballpark. And then the other team, again, do I feel great about it? No. But Louisville does have Sky Clark, Trey White, and a loaded recruiting class led by Trenton Flowers. If you believe in Kenny Payne, it is possible this team finds a way to be 6th in the ACC and make the tournament. So those are my other 3.
Okay.
Is there a long way to go for that to happen? Yes. What I will say, though, is they have talent to at least be considered in the conversation at this point. And I wanted to the other thing I wanted to say about Syracuse. I am really, really high on the Syracuse team. You talked about J.J. Starling, Julie Mintz, Naheem McLeod, another ACC transfer. There's your replacement for Jesse Edwards. And you had Chris Bell and Malik Brown, who were productive as freshmen on obviously what was a bad Syracuse team. So what does that actually mean? Who knows? But J.J. Starling, Judah Mintz, Benny Williams, and Naheem McLeod, with a couple other guys who have contributed to a Syracuse team before, not a bad place to start. And like you said, just the idea of getting to start fresh, new energy. Of the sort of quote-unquote bubble teams that outside of maybe the 4, if you want to put Miami in that top tier, Syracuse might be the team I feel best about. So, just going to throw that out there. I'm all in on Syracuse. Now, what that actually means, I don't know. But I will... Also, you know what? I'll say that Syracuse actually ends up making the NCAA tournament. There you go.
How about that? Okay. I'm fine with all of those, except Louisville. Louisville has no chance. They had talent last year, too.
Yeah. I'm going to hold out hope. I believe in Kenny Payne.
There were 5 top 100 recruits on that team last year. 5.
Not a lot of proven college basketball contributors, though.
I mean, they're not a lot of. I mean, you just said, and they have a loaded recruiting class. None of those guys are.
And I guess Sky Clark didn't exactly contribute a lot either. But
yeah. I mean, you go ask Illinois fans how they feel about Sky Clark as a proven college basketball commodity.
I'm holding out hope.
That's fine. I also don't have any faith in Kenny Payne, respectfully. We'll see.
And there needs to be some things proven to be confident in that. I'm just open to the possibility of it happening and some lessons being learned from last season.
Fair enough. 4-28. That's incredible. Louisville should never go 4-28 in anything ever, especially men's basketball. Anyways, your winner,
Duke.
Yeah.
Most experience, most talent. I'm also totally sold on John Shire's year 2. Now that he knows what this feels like, knows how to prepare, knows how to kind of navigate the season. He clearly showed an ability to improve a team during the season.
Mm-hmm.
That's helpful.
Because he got better as the season went on too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just because his team got better.
Yeah.
I think
they all collectively grew together.
Are you ready to call John Shire the best coach in this conference?
No.
Is he top 2?
No.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Okay, then who's your top 3 then?
So top 3 is a different conversation than top 2.
So who's top 2? Whatever.
Hamilton, Tony Bennett.
Okay.
100%.
I'm not I mean, Tony Bennett's 1.
Yeah.
Are we totally positive that Leonard Hamilton is 2 right now?
Yes.
Okay. I would probably agree with you. He's
I
probably
would,
3rd though.
I would be open to the possibility that if Duke does what Duke is supposed to, that coming into next season, John Shire is 3. Yes.
Maybe Larinaga has something to say about that. How do you feel about Jim Larinaga?
Oh yeah, Larinaga would be 3 right now, probably. Part of it is confusing with him because I just feel like there are these NCAA tournament caveats.
Sure.
Right, because they kind of go up and down. It's not like they're consistent, but they have won a couple ACC regular season titles. They have had some good basketball teams. Also, right, I mean, this started with that George Mason run, and now all of a sudden they just show up in the Elite Eight every season. It feels like for reasons that don't exactly make sense. But yeah, right now I would also throw Steve Forbes into that conversation, but it's not like Wake Forest have been a juggernaut since he got there. So definitely open to some maneuvering and some rising of John Shire's ranking this season.
Okay. I'd probably put him at 3 right now. Maybe 4. Maybe. And I think he's closer to 2 than you think he is.
We'll see how the season goes.
Okay. When Leonard Hamilton misses the when he misses the tournament, I'm just kidding. I'm not actually dogging Leonard Hamilton right now. It is interesting though. There's not a level of like it's either like we talked about earlier. Florida State goes through like they're either awesome for 5 years or they're not any good for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. Not in a commentary on Leonard Hamilton, just like I don't think there's a need to have a commentary on Leonard Hamilton. He's a pretty universally thought of as a really good basketball coach. And the makeup of his tournament appearances is just doesn't match most people who are in kind of the same tier of coach as he is.
Yes.
Anywho. All right. Anything else in the ACC?
Yeah, we got to do my favorite part where we run down the teams we haven't talked about yet.
All right, hurry.
Yeah, Notre Dame. Your top 7 players are gone. You got Julian Roper from Northwestern, Tay Davis from Seton Hall, Keba Jai from Penn State, who I believe was Penn State's highest recruit ever. He's following Micah Shrewsbury. Is that enough to win a lot of games in the ACC? No. I do like the idea of this being a building block for a team 2 seasons from now. That Micah Shrewsbury has something to work with. It's just not going to translate to wins this season. Who else have we not talked? We talked about Pittsburgh. The recruiting class is good. That's exciting. Again, you just look at that roster and there are so few proven commodities. I see that being a dramatic downturn after last season where kind of you got lightning in a bottle with all of the experienced veterans that came in. Boston College does return most of the team outside of Mekhi Ashton Langford. That's a positive. Again, it's returning most of a team that struggled in ACC play. So You know, they couldn't shoot the ball, couldn't defend the three, but at least they got some experience there. Georgia Tech, you got Miles Kelly, Dallin Coleman, Lance Terry. Good job protecting the basketball. Wanted to give them a shout out for their fundamentals. Now, they couldn't force turnovers, but they protected the basketball.
Well done.
So you do have some teams at the bottom of this conference that are getting most of their team back. You and I are kind of on the same page of what does that actually mean in terms of improvement. But in an ACC where there are a lot of question marks across the board, maybe we get surprised by somebody. Mm-hmm. But that's all I
got. Tony Carr is the highest ranked recruit in Penn State history. Kevin Ng is second.
Okay. Maybe somebody else had him. I might have missed that. Maybe somebody else had him ranked higher. I thought I saw that
Perhaps.
When he committed there. But yeah, he's
on 247 Sports. So
okay.
So ESPN could have had him higher than Tony Carr. That's totally possible.
Yeah, I don't know. They're just he didn't kind of steal the show last season, but Micah Struder's recruiting crown jewel is with him at Notre Dame. So
I find the all-time commits row on everybody's page.
Oh, you love that.
Fascinating. Yeah. I love it. 14th best recruit in Penn State history, Rasir Bolton. Remember when that hit the fan?
Mm-hmm.
Tim Frazier shouts. He's the number 10 overall recruit. I also love where there's a little logo below everybody's name, like what the organization they're a part of now, if they did play in the NBA, which is interesting because Lamar Stevens has been a Cavalier for a while. So I don't totally understand why Josh Reeves has a Mavericks logo underneath him, but Lamar Stevens has a Penn State logo. And
was it a team that was drafted him?
Perhaps. Maybe that's it. Anywho, it's been 77 minutes, so we should probably stop the podcast at this point. What are we doing next week? Is it Big East? Is that what we do? Is it the East, and then we do the numbers? Is that usually how it goes? I think that's how it goes.
We can decide.
We can decide later. You'll see whatever podcast pops up next Monday. That's what we decided to do. But that's the ACC preview. We'll be back next week for preview part 2 of 6 or of 12, if you want to include the interviews. So long way to go before the start of the regular season, but it's fun to talk about 2023-24 conference previews. Please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod. Check out the YouTube. Just type Jays for Days Pod in the search bar, and you'll find us right there. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh, and we will see you later.